Thank you. Good morning. Can everybody hear me all right? Maybe? All right. Very good. As you guys have probably figured out by now, we're not the best tech people on the planet. We'll stick to what we do know, and that is sled dogs. So I'm going to start off with a very brief video here, and then we'll jump right in.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is 29-year-old Dallas Seavey winning his third consecutive Iditarod championship.
A new official record for Iditarod.
He is our champion.
So I like to play a little bit of a video just to get the imagery, because I'm going to guess that most of you are not intimately familiar with sled dog racing, right? Fair guess? All right. But by the time we're done here, when the fall rolls around, you guys will not be excited about Super Bowl and that whole thing. You'll be stoked about the Iditarod coming up in a few months, so that's going to be our goal for today. My family has been racing sled dogs, and specifically the Iditarod, for a very long time. My grandfather first got his very first sled dog in 1963. He moved to Alaska from the relative warmth of Minnesota and promised my grandmother this would be a 2-year move. He could get this little mushing bug out of his system. He had listened to Sergeant Preston on the radio, Sergeant Preston and his lead dog King solving the mysteries of the Yukon, right? So he wanted to go experience Alaska, the last frontier, and sled dogs particularly. So they got up there, and one thing led to another, and one dog led to 2 dogs, leads to 10 dogs, and 2 years led to 50-plus years, and my grandmother is still waiting for that 2-year time to expire so they can retreat to the relative warmth of Minnesota there. But it's unlikely to happen at this point, I suppose. In that span, my grandpa started kind of our family mushing. I don't know what the right word for it. I don't want to use the word legacy. It's more like purgatory, I guess, because why couldn't my family have gotten into golf or surfing or something that's either warm or profitable, or both maybe? That'd be great. But instead, we got into mushing. My grandfather had this great idea, along with a few other kind of traditional mushers early on, and that was to retrace the steps of the Iditarod Trail, which is a historic trail in Alaska. It was the supply routes used to service all of the mining towns that were spread out over this vast nothingness that was Alaska. They used sled dogs. Sled dogs in Alaska did the exact same job that horses did in the Wild West, and they were just as important. Nothing moved without the aid of sled dogs all winter long. As soon as the rivers froze and the barges could no longer move, it was sled dogs that everybody relied on. 1908, we have records of a single sled dog being sold for over $3,000. This is when gold was worth $20 an ounce. So it shows you the relative value of a sled dog to these people's way of life. So what my grandfather and a few other mushers, most notably Joe Reddington Sr., wanted to accomplish was to run the entire 1,000 miles of the Iditarod Trail sled dog, or the Iditarod Trail, and turn it into a sled dog race. And that's how we now have the race. And as was mentioned earlier, this also helps commemorate the 1925 diphtheria outbreak in Nome and the sled dogs that saved the town. Now, one of the unique things about that diphtheria outbreak is it was kind of the last hurrah for sled dogs. It's probably one of the best known events that sled dogs have ever been part of, but it was also the last time that sled dogs were honestly the fastest way to move materials across the Arctic. At that point, there was a race between airplanes and dog teams. The airplanes were taking over the mail contracts they could get around, but fortunately, antifreeze hadn't been invented yet, so the alcohol systems that the planes ran on were freezing up at the 50 below temperatures that they had in 1925. Had it been a warmer day, airplanes would have delivered that serum, but it was right at that turning point. But now we have the Iditarod to remember and kind of commemorate that history in Alaska. My grandfather competed in the inaugural 1,000-mile race, finished third in that race, and it was more of an expedition back then than a race. It was more of see if we can make it this distance, and they did. Now, this is the life that I was born into. Now, being medical professionals, you probably know this, but believe it or not, I was born at a very young age. So, right? So I don't remember exactly how it played out, but this is how I envision it. One day I crawled out of a doghouse and tripped over my furry mother, and there's my sibling. You can see the hind leg up there in the corner. All of my conscious life, I have been around sled dogs. My family actually did move out of state for a brief span of about 5 years. And I was actually born not in Alaska. Don't hold it against me. I did move back to Alaska as quickly as I could. I was back there by the time I was 5 years old. And in the meantime, my grandpa still had dogs all the while. But all my life has been spent around these guys. And I think that's an important part of what I do now. Before I ever trained a single sled dog, I was effectively trained by sled dogs. They were much closer to me than your average pet. It wasn't like you come home from school or come home from work and your fluffy dog is there and you can tell them about your hard day. We all appreciate dogs like that. I have a little Sheltie dog, and it's great for that sort of thing. But what kind of life that I had with sled dogs was very different because my dad had about 120, 130 dogs most of my childhood. He was competitively racing the Iditarod. And having 4 boys was a lot of free labor. So that being said, we didn't go to school. We were homeschooled all the way through high school. Actually, correction, we weren't really so much homeschooled as just home. And that also will probably become apparent along with the concussions here in a bit. But this is a crucial part of my, I think, later success or enjoyment of the sport, is that when I grew up seeing the world from the same way the sled dogs did, understanding the things the way they did, understanding and learning about the world when my eyeballs were the same distance off the ground as theirs were. And you start to appreciate how they understand a problem or how they perceive a situation, and that helps me to better fit the solution. How are we going to navigate this team through a certain situation? It doesn't come from how I see the situation. I'm a human. I can think about things, I can think about into the future and past experiences and draw it all together and logically reason, okay, this is the worst thing that'll happen, or this is why it's good or bad or not so bad, or I can call or I can do this. They don't understand that. They see things a very different way. And that happens within human teams too. But just to appreciate how your teammates are viewing the same situation really does help you customize and adapt to how best to lead them. By the time I was 15, 16, I was doing some pretty fun stuff with dog teams. Again, when you're homeschooled and you're 16 years old and you have 100 dogs, fun is taking out a team of dogs, and this is actually on Devil's Pass Trail, which was said to be impassable by dog teams, so naturally my brother and I took dog teams and had to go over the pass. This is actually an avalanche chute, not very safe. I plunged down in there. We kind of tumbled down the mountain and started driving the dogs back up the mountain. My brother snapped this picture. But what I love about it is just the simple focus, particularly in your lead dogs up there. They're driving up this mountain, which looks perfectly natural. Where else are they going to go? But in that moment, if you zoom out, here you have a huge mountain. There's not a single trail or track on it. And this is an avalanche chute with the most loose, soft, kind of tumbly snow going all the way down, clearly a very steep part of the mountain. And this dog is driving up the mountain. Why? Simply because I asked him to. I said, we're going to go this direction. He doesn't know what's up there or what isn't up there. Why is it important? Simply because he trusts both me and also the team as a whole. One dog cannot run up this thing even by themselves. There's going to be time that they're going to need the other dogs to help kind of pull them up when they lose footing or whatnot. So it's not just the confidence and the trust that there's a reason that we're doing this, but also the trust and the confidence that they're not going to be doing it alone. The rest of the team is going to be doing it with them. This makes everything seem doable for a sled dog. They have to be able to do it as a pack. This is another very large difference between humans and dogs, and what makes dogs, I think, a great area to learn about teamwork and leadership is while people appreciate good teamwork, people appreciate good leadership, and we certainly function better in an environment that endorses that and helps grow that, sled dogs require it. This is a genetic must. These guys are a pack animal. Sled dogs are one of the most natural domesticated dogs on the planet. About 10,000 years ago, they were wolves. They were gradually domesticated by the native population in Alaska, Siberia, and elsewhere. But they never really lost a few key traits. One of those being that they've always been in a pack. They've always been in a group. They haven't become an individual dog that lives in a house. They've always been outside, in a group, traveling. And these are those real core traits that makes them require good leadership, good teamwork. They have to have that. And one of the scariest things in the world to a sled dog is a weak team or not being able to keep up with a team. Those are two very important facts because that's where their security comes from and that's what they thrive on. So we're probably wondering a little bit, what the heck is the Iditarod? We've thrown that word out here a few times. We touched on it briefly. The Iditarod now is the longest sled dog race in the world. It is the World Championship of long distance racing, and it goes over 1,000 miles, starting down in Anchorage. We have a ceremonial start. It's the big city. And then we start for real in Willow, which is very near where I live now. We're going to work our way kind of northwest across the state until we get up to Ophir. Depending on the year, whether it's an odd-numbered year or an even-numbered year, even-numbered years, we're going to split north and go up through the traditional towns of Ruby, Galena, and Nolato, back to Caltag. Odd numbers, we're going to drop south and go to these checkpoints, again, back to Caltag, and then finally end up in Nome. The reason for the split is that, one, the historic Iditarod Trail was a trail system, not a single path from Seward, which is near Anchorage, all the way to Nome, but it encompassed all these villages in between. So it's to travel on more of the traditional trail and also to involve more of the native villages along the way. One of the key factors that pushed us to actually start the race, or mushers to start the race in 1973, was the disappearance of sled dogs. They wanted to do something to keep those sled dogs in the forefront and keep people kind of seeing them and remembering that part of our history. The checkpoints along the way are places that we can send food and supplies prior to the race. Last year I sent out over 2,000 pounds of food and supplies. So as we're racing along the trail, we can pull into those checkpoints, pick up our food and straw that the dogs are going to rest on, the fuel to cook for them, and continue down the trail and rest anywhere that we like, or we are welcome to stay and rest in those checkpoints. But it is up to the musher if you stop in the checkpoints, and if so, for how long. You start the race with 16 dogs, and as you progress down the trail, you can leave a dog behind at any checkpoint along the way for any reason. There's over 50 veterinarians that volunteer along the race. When you arrive at a checkpoint, they're going to inspect every single dog at every checkpoint, and if you'd like to leave one of the dogs behind with them, they'll take care of it for a day or two and then fly it home for you. But now you must go on with one less dog. You do not get a replacement dog. So it's about managing a team over the entire 1,000 miles. And the dogs that reach the finish line in Nome will have run the entire way. Lastly, the person that's driving the team is called a musher. The musher is the only person that can do anything for their dogs, themselves, or their equipment. We are allowed no outside assistance. This is a non-stop race, so when they say go, the clock starts ticking and it doesn't stop till we reach the finish line. It doesn't matter whether we're resting or running or whatever we're doing out there. We have to do it efficiently and quickly if we're going to be competitive. So this is what I grew up focusing on and trying to figure out how to kind of crack the code. Every single year, my dad tried to win the Iditarod. And these are the iconic images of winning the Iditarod. You're mushing down Front Street in Nome. There's thousands of people out there. It'll be some random time of the day or night when you arrive. They've got the lights out there and the sirens going. Then the lead dog is going to be, the musher's lead dogs are presented with the yellow roses. That's a very iconic photo of an Iditarod champion with the two lead dogs and the yellow roses. And this was the goal that we tried to accomplish every single year. And every single year from when I was about 7 years old we tried and seemingly failed, I guess, in some context, right? We'd go out there and my dad was sure that this was the year. He'd figured it out. And the race would start out great. He'd be near the front. And then towards the later miles of the race, he'd start to kind of peter out and he'd be from, in the top 5. Well, maybe he'll end up in the top 10 or maybe he'll end up in the top 15, then he'd finish 16th. And then the next year would be a little bit better, 9th. Okay, we got it figured out. The year after that, I'd be taking a step back. But we were always trying to find the next problem to solve. And by the time I got to be about 15 years old, it started to feel like this Iditarod, winning it, was reserved for somebody else. These were superhuman people or individuals, I don't know, demigods or whatever they were that won the Iditarod, because it became just something up on a pedestal. I view these guys as literally gods that were winning the Iditarod. Because seeing your father, who obviously is somebody that I looked up to, trying so hard, and there's not just him, but the entire family going into it every single year and coming up short every single year, really built that up, and it made it something larger than life to me. When I was 16, my dad finally cracked the code. He finally accomplished his lifelong goal of winning the Iditarod on his 11th attempt. And I think that's when I was standing about 10 feet out of frame here waiting for him to cross the finish line. And I had been very involved in helping train this team that year. Both my older brothers had gone off to college, and that made me kind of the main training assistant, I guess. So I felt very personally invested in that team. And when he won the Iditarod with that group of dogs that we had spent so much time developing and training and felt like we had done everything right, every single step of the year, we did things to the best of our ability and never once cut a corner. If it was 4 in the morning and you finally laid down and you remembered that, Fluffy you forgot to give him his meds, it was back out there, do what you need to do. It was not a single step missed. And I think that's when I realized that this is probably what I'm going to end up spending my entire life doing, and someday I'm going to win the Iditarod. Unfortunately, winning the Iditarod is not always the finish lines and the bright lights and all the hoorah. 90% of the time it's more like this, which I guess in some contexts is a little less pleasant, but also this is what you kind of have to love. If you're going to be a dog musher, this is what you're going to spend most of your time doing. And I think it's very important that this is what you enjoy and appreciate, and you're invested in this. Because again, this is what wins the Iditarod, from there to there. Those are the dogs that are actually going to run each step of the trail. And if you're out there suffering your way through it so that you can later maybe have the glory of winning the Iditarod, these guys, they know, they sense that. You have to be invested in this 100%. They don't know, they being the dogs, they don't know if this is race day or if this is training day. It's simply a day. This is right now, and we're doing what we're doing. And if this person that's going along with us is sometimes into it and sometimes not, that's not a very reliable teammate nor a very reliable leader. You have to be in it 100% every single day, because for them, running is running. It doesn't matter if it's on the Iditarod or not. So you have to be involved every single day, whether it's the race or not, and committed. So when I was 21, I guess, I decided that now was the time to start my racing career, to start building my team and focus on winning the Iditarod. And I set a goal of not just wanting to get involved and start racing. I had previously run the Iditarod twice with young dogs from my parents' kennels, just kind of getting them training and experience so that they could then go in and race on my dad's competitive team. It's kind of our college program to get the dogs over the trail and have a good year of training as a 2-year-old. Racing is not the priority. Simply finishing and having a good experience and building confidence for the dogs. That's the priority. But in 2008, I was ready to actually start my own kennel and wanted to branch off. Earlier, I'd become the youngest person ever to finish the race, so I figured, why not set the goal of becoming the youngest person to ever win the race, right? That gave me a whopping, 4 years to go from not owning a single sled dog to trying to win the world championships. So where do you start when you don't own a single dog, a vehicle, property, not even in one harness? Where do you start? Starts with trying to round up a little bit of financing, and certainly making the claims of I'm going to be the youngest Iditarod champion helped with that. But the next step is getting a few dogs brought together. And I'm going to bring my little fluffy companion up here in just a second, but this was the first gang of dogs that I pulled together. To put it into context, I was operating on about a $60,000 budget, starting with zero, nothing. Most race teams, the value of the dogs in the team alone, not that they would ever be sold, but if they were, would be in the neighborhood of $250,000 to $300,000 for that 16 dogs that are on the team. Now, those dogs represent a much greater kennel of oftentimes 100 to 150 dogs, because those dogs go everywhere from fluffy little 1-week-old puppy to 16-year-old dog. You have the entire life cycle, not just racing age. So when we had our very finite budget, then it became about finding the dogs that we could work with and finding dogs that were pretty much anything for sale. And we rounded up what were later kindly nicknamed the Scrubs, because they look like absolutely everything. We had everything from Guinness here, who was a whopping 43 pounds, but her biggest trait was she had great genetics. So her sales pitch, at least, was she'll be a great breeding dog. She's not a racing dog, but she's going to have awesome puppies down the road. All her brothers are great racing dogs. She's just a little too small. All the way up to Cessna, which you can see one fluffy ear here, who was over 70 pounds. So we had quite a lot of variety in the kennel there. But the one thing that all these dogs that I rounded up, and I got all of 16, right? You need 16 to race, so 16 is plenty, of course. So I got 16 dogs, and the only thing that every one of them had in common is they had just been fired from their previous job, which actually gives you some pretty good information, right? Because now what you know is that these dogs have all proven that they don't excel in the traditional systems. The systems they've been working in haven't been working for them. And that really was what training was about at the time, and most of mushing as a whole. There's a few trends going on. One was our training was very much about selection. You'd have a big kennel, you'd bring a lot of dogs into the racing program, you'd set a high bar for training, and the ones that surpassed that bar stayed and the other ones got sold. That was kind of how it worked. It was more about selection than development. With only 16 dogs, the question was not who is going to be on the team in March. The question was, how good can we get them between now, September, and March? How much can we develop each dog? And then how do we arrange that team to have the best performance as a unit? Now I want to bring in one of my little fluffy companions up here. He's going to help me out. But hey, Hero. He's sleeping on the job over here. So this is Hero, and he is one of my, we're going to come right up here, buddy. He's one of my racing dogs now. He was not one of these original guys. He's, all of these guys are retired, and he is fairly housebroke, so we're just going to kind of put that caveat out here. Not 100%, but that's one of the great things about dogs, is they have absolutely no shame. They live in the moment right now, and if right now they have to go to the bathroom and there's a plant, guess what they do? Come on, buddy. There you go. Stretch out. Yeah. So, Hero was not in this original gang, but he is one of my main racers now, and we're going to use him in some of the stuff we get into a little bit later on. But this gang here, what was unique about them was that they were kind of the outcast, and they were going to be my learning program. These guys were going to help teach me how to race the Iditarod, and that's what we had to do, is figure out how to set up a program that both works for them individually to develop them and let them see the best way to travel as a group, and also as an environment to help teach me. I knew that these guys were going to be my main team in a few years when we were actually going to be racing to try to win the race, but in the meantime, it was about trying to develop this gang. All right, Hero. Move forward. So the first thing that you have to do when you're traveling on the Iditarod is travel, right? Traveling is the most important part of racing the Iditarod because we have to cover 1,000 miles. And that's what marks the finish, is once we've completed that distance. In that process, though, like I said earlier, it's up to the mushers when we run and rest. So one of the most basic strategic points of the Iditarod is how long do you run, how long do you rest? This was the other kind of trend that was happening in mushing at the time, was as mushers were getting better and better dogs, genetically speaking, they were going farther and farther. Their technique wasn't really getting better. They were just sitting there standing toe-to-toe, two great dog teams just kind of slugging it out. One of them would do a 70-mile run. The next one would do an 80-mile run. And so we were on this trend of going farther and farther and farther. That's how mushers were trying to race the Iditarod. But what we were also missing is that the resting periods were never really trained, first of all. And secondly, that was kind of a fixed point. The mushers would stop generally about 6 hours. That was kind of the standard stopping time. But then they would go and do an 80 or 90-mile run. And like I said, the dogs were good enough at the time that they were doing it quite well. Training for this race was generally to go out on a single day and do a 70 to 100-mile run. And then the dogs would have 2 or 3 days off, and they'd do it again. But I wanted to set up an environment, a system that was more about, like I said, learning what's the best way to train and develop these guys, and also getting them used to the entire life cycle of being on the Iditarod. So we made every single day of training just like we were going to do the race. When we left the kennel, we weren't going to come home after 70 or 80 miles. We were going to be out there for 2 or 3 days. That being said, I didn't really care how far we traveled because I knew that every dog on the team couldn't do those 80, 90, 100-mile runs without having injuries or getting fatigued. So we started asking questions rather than saying this is what we're going to do. So I started out very short, doing 25, 30-mile runs and taking a shorter break and then traveling again. We're simply moving down the trail. We were traveling with sled dogs. That's what the base of the sport is about. And trying to find out the best kind of balance or equilibrium for these guys that was the right traveling pace, distance, and resting time. What we came up with was a little bit of a different style where we would be keeping the runs down to 40 to 45 miles, about half the distance that was the trend of the winning teams at the time. But then we also were able to shorten the resting periods down to about 4 hours, a little bit under, 3:45 to 4 hours, kind of our standard resting time. What we found there was we started to bring confidence back into this team. Dogs that had been able to travel with some of the longer haul teams, dogs that were able to make the 90-mile runs but had learned that they couldn't pull that hard because they would get tired. We're now starting to lean back into the harness and pull a little bit harder. So our traveling speeds are what we're going to rely on, traveling quickly between checkpoint and checkpoint and hopefully maintaining speed all the way to the end. But there was a few other benefits that we started to learn about. First of all, spending every single day on the trail with the dogs, we didn't really ever go home. So what was great for these guys is this became home. Many dogs, when they were on the Iditarod, they weren't used to eating out of a strange little camping bowl or sleeping on the straw, and there's a dozen school kids that are running around here at the same time. This wasn't where they were used to sleeping. They were used to training being one thing, and then they go home and they live at home. We started living on the trail. I started to be able to better manage them because I knew exactly what every single dog needed for food at different temperatures. A sled dog on the Iditarod, especially Hero size here, is going to be burning between 12 and 14,000 calories a day when it's 40 to 50 below zero. They're on average now traveling 130 miles a day. That's a lot of traveling that we're doing in a very short period of time. So knowing what they need nutritionally is a huge aspect. Secondly, when we arrived in the checkpoint, every single dog knew the drill. We pulled in, and there was a routine. There was a pattern. And they like that security. They like to know what to expect. And it wasn't a question of if they were hungry. And this was a major problem that mushers were facing in the Iditarod. They would do these 80 or 90-mile runs. They'd reach the checkpoint, and they had passed in an invisible line, where when they reached the checkpoint, the dogs were not so much hungry as tired. So when they got to the checkpoint, what did they do? They didn't stand up and eat food. They curled up and went to sleep. But food is really the limiting factor, because these guys need the fuel. So after sleeping for 2 hours, then they would be able to wake up the dogs, feed the dogs, and then they would go back to sleep for 4 hours and digest that food. But by coming to the checkpoints with a team that wasn't tired, that was able to easily keep going, maybe even twice the distance, food was the priority. They pulled in, they ate their food, they curled up and went to sleep. This was more efficient use of our time. If we were going to be running, we were going to be running quickly. And if we were going to be stopped, we were going to be resting to maximize our time. That is, resting with food in their stomachs, sleeping. And I came up with something of a theory in mushing, and that is if the dogs are not running, sleeping, or eating, it's wasted time. Everything else we have to streamline. Those things are important. We have to get those in, and we have to do those things to the best of our ability. So like I said, if we're running, we have to be doing it quickly. If we're resting, they need to be sleeping solidly and soundly, not sitting there waking up every single time a strange person walks by. And some checkpoints, the best thing you can do is not stop there, because there is too much commotion, and particularly if you're leading the race. There's many checkpoints that all go through the checkpoint, pick up food and straw and fuel, and go just 3 or 4 miles down the trail where it's nice and quiet, and then you can camp with your dogs. So once these guys get their meal on the Iditarod, the next step is the massages and the pretty much getting them bedded down. And as soon as we finish each run, or let me take a step back, when we're traveling on the trail, what I'm doing as a musher is watching each dog individually, and I'll keep my eyes on Hero here for 2 minutes as he runs down the trail. And then I'll go to the next dog and watch him for 2 minutes, and then the next dog. And what I'm looking for is not, a limp. If you have a dog that's limping on the trail, they should have been left behind 2 days ago. What you're looking for is a dog like Hero, who generally has a nice, pretty kind of rolling lope. And now if he's on a similar trail that he generally lopes on in a similar speed, and he's using some other gait, or even leading with the opposite leg of what he usually leads with, this is indicative of a developing tiredness, soreness. He's starting to do things differently, to use the different muscle groups to accommodate the workload. This is very clear with trotting dogs that are moving their front right leg and hind left leg in unison, and then vice versa. And now they start to lope, and then they start to lope and lead on the other side, and then they'll start to pace where they move both their right legs and then both their left legs. You see these shifts, and that's going to be your first early warning sign that something's going on with the dog. It might be a little snowball in their pads and their booties or something like that, but you need to figure it out. So you're constantly watching them. Once you get to the checkpoint, you want to stand up for me, Hero? It's like, not really. You stand up, big guy. Oh. Once you get to the checkpoint, and these guys have all had their food, and you've gotten their little boots off of their feet, you're going to go through and kind of stretch their shoulders back. You want to give me a shoulder? We'll just be patient. There you go. You're going to stretch it back and then extend it forward, just checking for range of motion. You're going to feel just down their hairs. Most dogs are going to give you clues. Even if you're just bringing your hand gently down the hairs, if they have a soreness, they'll tell you. And if you start bringing your hand down there and it's something sensitive, they'll put their nose over there, or they'll kind of turn their body away from it. So just listen to them and see what there is. You're feeling for heat. You're feeling for any swelling or inflammation in their forearms. If you do find anything, it's going to be massage time, and then you're going to work them with different liniments and oils. We can't use any drugs or steroids of any type, so it's all homeopathic or more traditional type medicines. And then we're going to put on the shoulder jacket on the dog that has little pockets for the hand warmers that go in there. Those hand warmers keep the heat on those muscles, and you're able to get them recuperated. If you have a minor fatigued muscle or a very minor sore muscle, you can fix that in 4 or 5 hours with massage and care and doing that day after day. If you have an actual injury, that's not something that you can fix in less than 2 weeks. And it's another great thing about compressing our cycles on the Iditarod is it gave me as the musher more time to assess the dogs, more opportunities to assess, and more opportunities to correct on our course. Now, some dogs are smarter than others, though. For example, Crazy, we'd get into the checkpoint, and I would be going through on my routine, as with the vets that go through the dogs and do essentially the same thing as I do, but being me, I like to actually do the physical exam myself as well, because I know what the dog generally looks like and what their range of motion generally is, more so than a vet that's never really worked with a dog before. So Crazy, she had it figured out. When the vets would go through and extend her shoulders forward or backward, as soon as they started to move it, she'd let out a very pathetic little whimper, ow, 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 and then they would go back, and it'd be the same thing, and the exact same thing on the left side. And of course, if a dog actually whimpers on the race, you have a really big problem. So the vet's eyes would get, big and round like that and think that this dog has a real problem. And then I would go over and lift the dog's tail up gently, and she would let out the same little whimper as everything else. Everything on her was just mortally wounded, right? But she had learned that if she was the one that let out a little whimper, she would get the 20 minutes extra massage and the heat blanket and the whole works. 4 hours later, she would pop up and be one of the hardest working dogs all the way to the next checkpoint and pull the same ruse when we got there. So with her, it was more about simply knowing that if there was a problem, the care would be there. The support would be there. If she did have an issue, that she would be taken care of. And I think that was a huge factor of her feeling comfortable operating in the team, was that if there's an issue, I'll be okay. Other dogs, like Hero, he's pretty stoic. You have to watch them on the other end of the spectrum, because if he does have a problem, he's not going to tell you. And so you have to keep a very close eye on these guys to make sure that you can find an issue when it's still a small issue. If he doesn't tell me until it's way too late, well, it's too late. So you have to keep a much closer eye on him. Now, once these guys are all bedded down and I've had them fed and they've gotten their massages, we've gotten all their traveling gear off, which we'll take a look at here in a second, and they're all taking their nap now. My job is to go through the whole process and get everything ready for the next run. Repack the sled, change the plastic that goes on the bottom of the runner so we have a nice slick surface to travel on. And this was another great thing about training like this every single day, is instead of doing 20 camps on the Iditarod and then not doing the whole camping process again till the next year, we did this every single week. We'd go out there and do 4 or 5 camps, 5 or 6 runs, and then we'd take a few days off and do it again. And I became very efficient in the whole process of taking care of the dogs. One of the big issues with only taking a 4-hour stop was that I had eliminated all the resting time that the person was supposed to get. In a 6-hour stop, the mushers generally got about a 2-hour rest. When you compress that down to a 4-hour stop, there's still pretty much the same amount of work to do, so the time that you're eliminating is the time that the person used to be able to sleep. So I had to become very efficient in that whole process. So we'd get into a checkpoint or into one of my checkpoints, which was somewhere out on the trail. I'd drop some food bags out there and then treat it just like it was a checkpoint in training. And then I would set up a camera on a tripod, and I would go through my whole program, bedding the dogs down, feeding them, cooking for them, melting the snow to get the water, doing the massages, everything I could, repacking the sled, and this whole process getting ready to go again. And then after the run, I'd go back and try to find anywhere that we could shave a few seconds, shave a little bit of time to make it more efficient and get back on the trail quicker, or at least make it to where if we're stopped for 4 hours, the dogs are resting for as much of that time as possible, and I'm getting as much sleep as possible. Because it starts to spiral out of control is as you get more tired, you become less efficient, which means at the next stop, you're even slower, which means you get less rest, and you start creating a negative spiral in there. We have to figure out how to turn that around to where each run is a good run that leads to a good rest, where the dogs eat their food, sleep efficiently, I work efficiently, I sleep well, we're all thinking clearly, we go on the next run, we make good decisions, we don't get lost, we have a good run that leads to another great rest. We're trying to create a positive spiral where each good step leads to a better step on the next day of the race, and we should be able to speed up as we go. So it became about efficiency in the everyday process of taking care of the dogs. And the question that helped me kind of solve these problems was, what do I do right now to best serve my team? What is the next step that I take right now to take care of this team? Because that kind of kept me thinking in the moment and not getting too far ahead of myself. There's time for that. But when you're taking care of the dogs, what do I do right now, right now, right now? It became just a constant habit of asking that question. What is the next thing I do for my team now? And it's become a very helpful kind of reminder, particularly when you're on day 7 or 8 of the Iditarod and very tired. What does the team need right now? Because if you can answer that question, it fixes a lot of other problems, or it certainly mitigates problems that you might encounter down the road. And this is why I love 1,000-mile races, is because you can get away with a lot of small mistakes on a 200 or 300-mile race. The finish line saves you before your errors in the first day of the race have time to catch up with you. On a 1,000-mile race, if you have any shortcuts, if you're not paying very close attention to the padding or the webbing in between the dog's pad on their feet, and they develop a little snowball, that has time to mature into a real problem after 8 or 9 days. So it's about thoroughness. It's about maintaining a healthy team for 9 days and traveling that distance. That's really what I love about the 1,000-mile races, is it's not so much about racing as it is about managing a team. So once the dogs are bedded down, everything's packed up for the next run, it's time for a quick nap. I generally just crash on the straw next to the dogs. I have it now where I can generally get 45 minutes to an hour of sleep out of that 4-hour rest period. That's kind of my hopes there. I'm going to get 2 to 2.5 of those 45-minute naps each day on the race. If it's probably 10 above or warmer, I'm just going to crash on the straw with the dogs. I'm not going to bother unpacking the sleeping bag. Below 10 above, it's probably worth it to get the sleeping bag out because you're going to sleep a little bit better. Again, you don't have that much time to get cold, so if you're warm when you lay down, you'll be warm enough for that 45 minutes that you're sleeping. If it's all the way down to 40, 50 below, if there's a building available, I'm going to be trying to find a corner to sleep in. Now, once you get done taking your nap, you're going to be getting the dogs back up ready to go again. Hang tight for 1 second, Hero. I got to grab your gear bag here. And this is probably one of the least favorite parts of the day for the mushers, is after you do take your nap and it's time to get ready to go, you're kind of cooled down because you've been sleeping and everything kind of slows down a little bit. Come here, buddy. And now you've got to go out there, and you want to be as quick as possible because as soon as you wake up the dogs to get them ready to go again, this time doesn't fall into our category of running, resting, or eating, right? Now when I have the dogs awake, gearing them up to go, whether it's putting on their fluffy jackets or the leggings that we use to protect the soft, or well, on the back of their forearm they have the only sweat gland on the dog, and that can actually freeze up, create an ice ball, ultimately could pull the hair out of the back of their legs, which makes them prone to having frostbite back here. So as a preventative measure, we put those leggings on them once it gets to a certain temperature. But the least favorite job is putting on booties. We put these shoes on the dogs before every single run, all year in training, and also on the Iditarod. They wouldn't have to have them every single run of the race, but my mentality on this is I put them on just as a general rule, and then if there's a reason not to have the booties on, very slippery trail conditions or it's too hot, I know that all the feet are healthy, and I'm able to kind of keep the booties off for that one run. But if you have 16 dogs and you got to go through and put these booties on, you've got 4 feet per dog, and you've got 64 little shoes to put on. This was something that we spent a lot of time working on. Most mushers would take about 30 to 40 minutes to get all the dogs bootied up because it's not simply going through the team and putting the booties on. It's 40 below. Your hands are freezing. You have a lot better dexterity not wearing gloves, and you can actually get them on quickly, but now you have skin exposed at very cold temperatures, which makes it very difficult. So this is one of the areas that I figured if we could focus on putting booties on and figure out how to do it much more quickly, there's a lot of available time to be saved here. So I spent most of several training years, can we put a bootie on you, buddy? Trying to figure out a better way to booty dogs. And ultimately, it came down to just how I held the foot and little stuff, and also booting the dog backwards. But I was able to save a few seconds, about 3 seconds per booty, and still have it on at the right tension. And it doesn't seem like a big deal, but I figured 3 seconds a foot is somewhere to start, right? And it was a little bit different process. Also, I became more kind of fluid with it, just simply spending the time training on them and getting those booties put on easier. And I was able to do it without waking up most of the dogs. Or if I did have to wake them up, I could put them on very quickly, pop the shoes on. And then I started thinking about it a little bit farther. Just 3 seconds a foot, and you can do the math on it here. In fact, I did because my memory's not that good. Too many concussions, So 3 seconds per foot over the 64 feet, 20 checkpoints, comes out to, long story short, is about 3,840 seconds, which is 64 minutes. 64 minutes over a 1,000-mile race, all right, that's pretty significant. But if you zoom out a little bit farther, I've now run 11 Iditarods, and I've been fortunate enough to win 4 of those races. 3 of those races I've won by less than an hour. So you start looking at something so small as 3 seconds per foot, which seemed like, when we started addressing the booty issue, it was mostly because I hate freezing my hands. I hate waking up, going out here at 40 below, putting the booties on. But then also it seemed like an opportunity to save time. It's something that we spend a lot of time doing. And even if we can save a small amount of time on a task that we do a lot of times, it adds up. Now, it's 3 out of 4 races that we've won have been within the margin of time saved simply on putting the shoes on. And so there's 1,000 little places, and that's become its own little game in this whole sport for me, is finding places that we can streamline just a little bit, save a few seconds. Now, once we get the dogs all bootied up, thank goodness we only have to do one, and it's about 75 degrees out here, huh, Hero? But once we get them all bootied up, depending on the temperature, we're going to put the jackets on, and we're back out on the trail. And hopefully we're moving down the trail briskly and quickly. That's kind of the goal out there. And this system, when we started our first real Iditarod in 2009, where we had actually trained this team on, we didn't really come up with a term for it, but we were kind of calling it event-style training, right? Where we're training like we're doing the event, total immersion training here. We're doing the same things every single day, not just the running, but also the resting. Looking at it from the dog's point of view, this isn't just one run. This is their life for 10 days, in and out. And this is going to create a lot of anxiety if they don't know what to expect. So make it something that they understand, that they know what's going to happen. They can understand that not only is there a process, I can pull as hard as I can because there's this next checkpoint coming up in 40 miles. The musher's never going to ask me to do something I can't do. That's kind of the number one rule of traveling with these guys, is they have to always trust that whatever we're doing, so long as I'm on the back of the sled, they know that they can do it to the best of their ability. Not just make it, but really excel at it. So in 2009, it was more about just trying the style. The best guess from all the race analysis was that we were going to have a 20th place finish was our best case scenario. About 9 days later, we pulled into Nome in 6th place, and I was only 30 minutes behind my dad and his Presidential Guard dog team. Every single dog in his team is within half an inch of each other in height. Their weight is exactly the same. He runs all male dogs, and it just looks like 16 pistons firing down the trail. It's a pretty scary dog team. So for us, the scrubs, to be bouncing in only 30 minutes behind them, we were very pleased with that. But one of the biggest things that was encouraging was how we were able to do it. I had been in 17th place with 300 miles to go, and we were able to maintain our speed to the end. We had power and speed at the end of the race. And that's, quite frankly, where pretty much every race is won, is at the finish, right? It's not about who's leading the race for the longest, but who's in the lead of the race at that one critical step, the finish line. The next year, we invested in that same style even more. We found more things to streamline, more processes to make a little bit more quick, and also we developed a lot more confidence in the team. That year, we came back and we finished in 8th place, but we finished 2 hours ahead of my dad and 2 positions, and we also finished 2 hours faster than any team out of my family's kennels had ever finished. So my dad and I were kind of becoming rivals at this point, competing against each other. We lived about 5 hours apart, which is almost far enough, and yeah, right? And so we have very similar genetics. Many of my dogs came from his kennel. Those were some of the main dogs I bought, but I also bought from several different kennels because I wanted to know, once I have a kennel established, and if I'm going to do this for the next 20 years, I want to know that I'm working with the best genetics, not just the ones that I had grown up working with. And what I found is that they were, in fact, the best genetics, so thank goodness. 2011, we decided to take that style one step farther. Not only are we going to run the Iditarod, but we're going to run the 1,000-mile Yukon Quest as a training run. And that race finishes only 2.5 weeks before the Iditarod starts. Went out there, and we're not concerned with racing in the least. Like I said, the Iditarod was our main race. It was 2.5 weeks after the Yukon Quest. We're just going to use this 1,000 miles traveling as event-style training, right? It's a total immersion training experience. We went into that race, which is very traditionally a long-run race. They have very slow traveling speeds, and they do really long distances. And we ran it like we were going to do the Iditarod. Short run, short rest, kept the speed up, and we were way in the back of the race. I think I was about 16 hours behind at the halfway point. And then through a series of bad storms and just tough trails that made things even harder for these long-haul teams, and conditions that a fast team was able to make up a lot of time in, we actually ended up winning the first race that I had ever won in my entire life by accident. A race that we weren't even trying to race. It was just simply that we had a healthy team. We weren't racing. We weren't competing. Our only focus was on training and developing and building the team. And lo and behold, that's the team that wins it at the end. And it gave me a lot of confidence to go all in on this style, knowing that the goal is not to try to win the race. The goal is to try to build a healthy team and maintain a healthy team. And if you do that, the race wins itself. That'll take care of itself. Focus on the steps, the causes, not the effect. Winning the race is the effect. What are the causes? These guys eating enough food every day, them staying within their easy working range and not ever overextending them on one run, having good resting periods, making good decisions the entire time. These are the causes that then produce the effect of winning the Iditarod. That year, we went into the Iditarod 2.5 weeks after winning the Yukon Quest. Actually broke the record on the Iditarod, but finished in 4th place since, unfortunately, 3 other people broke the record that year too. So anyway, we're happy with it. 2012 rolls around, and this was our final opportunity to become the youngest person to win the Iditarod. But this was also kind of the year that we were working towards. All the dogs really started to gel. They worked together as the same group of dogs, and they were kind of getting nearer to retirement, but they were all mature. They'd all done this. They knew the drill. They knew what to expect, and they knew each other. I think that was a pretty critical point on them. So we started the race in 2012, and we're really focused on simply do the same thing we've been doing. Just run a conservative race, maintain a healthy team, make good decisions, and we'll see where this thing plans out at the end. We had made up a lot of time in the last 300 miles of every race we'd ever run. So I figured best case scenario, I'll be within 5 hours with 300 miles to go, and we can at least take a shot at trying to win the race. This was the first time I felt like we actually had a chance. And things went really, really well. Almost too well, actually. As we were traveling down the trail, we found ourselves, I think in Galena, about 600 miles into the race. And instead of being 6 hours behind or 5 hours behind with 300 or 400 miles to go, I find myself actually in lead of the race with 400 miles to go, which is kind of a scary situation. Because now, when I pull into a checkpoint, there's, a whole bunch of media that I'd never seen before because I'd never been in the front of the race before. I'd always been buried in the back of the pack. I didn't even know those folks were out there. But we pull into the checkpoint, and now it's, what are we going to do? And immediately I start thinking about all the things I'd grown up watching and reading and studying this race. How did winners win the Iditarod? What did they do in the final miles? Coming into that checkpoint, I had passed the person that I was kind of ended up racing with, Allie Zirkle. I passed her coming into the checkpoint. We had had a little bit faster run time reaching the checkpoint, so we were very close to each other, but there's still a lot of race to go. So what comes to mind is what every musher has ever done in that position, and that is to try to put a gap between them and second place, to try to create this buffer, put the final nail in the coffin, so to speak. So I take care of my dogs as quickly as I possibly can, and even though we had just done a 50-mile run, and they had traveled plenty fast to overtake the other musher and then reach the checkpoint, I went inside and set my alarm clock for a very brief nap, and I was going to leave the checkpoint in 3 hours. That would give us a 1-hour lead, and then I could try to work from there. So I take my very short nap, pick up my parka, which I had draped on the floor to try to dry a little bit, my bag, and I'm walking out to the dog team, and these guys are zonked out about like that. And as I'm getting to the team, what hits me is the same question I've asked myself 1,000 times, and that is, what do I do now for this team? What do they need right now? And it was pretty clear that right now these guys need rest. And let me just say, when you're at this point in the race, things just happen in your brain, and you don't really have a whole lot of control about it. You're more of just like somebody witnessing or viewing this other thinking process happen. It's kind of strange. You're not really generating it for the most part. So I find myself standing there thinking this team needs sleep. They just worked very hard to get here as quickly as we did, trusting that they're going to have this 4-hour break. And despite that it seems like the right thing to do to win the race, to try to get a lead, it's what everybody's done before, I have to see if this style works. We have to play this through all the way to the end. And if it ends up costing us the race, at least I know it now. And the next 10 years, I can make better decisions. Long story short, I ended up turning around, going back inside, getting a much appreciated, another 30 minutes of rest, and giving the dogs their full 4 hours plus the 15 minutes that we had overtaken the other musher. And so I added a little bit of rest in there. We were going to invest heavily and rest the team, see what happens, follow this through all the way to the finish line, and forget about the race. Who cares about the race right now? Let's run the team to the finish. We took off from that checkpoint at a very healthy speed. We outran second place musher by 30 minutes on the next run. I gave him 4 hours and 30 minutes. Add that rest back in. We started a new style. We were more focused on building speed than building a lead. That was kind of our mantra at this point, is invest in the team. Because the team is your ability to overcome obstacles. If I invest in a lead, if I kept shorting the rest and getting a little bit farther ahead, what ends up happening is that, yes, I have a lead, but I no longer have control. That lead is not something that I have power over. If a storm comes, if bad weather comes, if I oversleep, there's 1,000 reasons and 1,000 ways that you can lose a lead. But if I have speed, if I have a healthier team, I can make it through worse storms than anybody else. If something does stop the entire race and we're all lined up and we take off, I'll just have a lead again because I have speed. I have the power in the team that gives us the ability to overcome challenges. This is something we can control. We kept doing this day after day after day, reinvesting in the team. Every mile that we ran, we did faster and faster and faster. Each run that we did faster than the competition, I gave that time of rest back to the dogs. And each following run, we again did faster. And after, I think, 9 days, 4 hours, and about 20 minutes, not that I was counting, I actually got to live through my childhood dream of running down Front Street in Nome and actually winning the Iditarod. And I guess one of the most unique things about it was that it wasn't, well, I guess what I had always expected, which was the hoorah, we won the Iditarod, we've beaten everybody. It was actually a pretty emotional situation, I think, largely because when you're sleep deprived, you bear your emotions kind of on the outer layer. There's not much bearing at that point. And so what I felt was this overwhelming sense of just appreciation and pride in this team, what these guys had become and what they'd been able to do, their ability to travel. And that became the goal. It was no longer about winning the race. It was about building that team, recreating this, it's like ice sculptures. It's a piece of art that you develop, you create, but then it doesn't last. It's going to melt. Next winter, you build a new one. And it's about that building process, not what you end up with. You don't create a piece of art that you hang on your wall for 1,000 years. You create something for the sake of creating it. That's why you're doing it. And that's what training a dog team has kind of become. We mushed down Front Street, thousands of people cheering, yay, lots of fun. But the coolest part was little Guinness, who had become my #1 lead dog, and she had done more than her fair share of leading, particularly in the very tricky steering sections. That's where she was great. We had a phenomenal connection, and she was the dog I could always rely on to go step for step. Beetle and Elam, these two guys in front, they were my long-haul truckers. They were the guys I put up there. They didn't set a phenomenal pace, but it was easy for them mentally. They would gladly trot along up there for any distance, but they weren't going to go super fast. Diesel, this guy right here, along with Guinness, were kind of the speed leaders. So they had done a lot of the work earlier on. So then finally, you get your lead dogs wreathed in the yellow roses, and I have Diesel and little Guinness on the upper right-hand corner. And that dog was the one that was supposed to be too small to ever actually race the Iditarod. She was supposed to be the breeding dog, the matriarch, which she definitely has become. But she not only was my yellow rose lead dog, but one step farther, she was nominated for and ultimately received the Golden Harness Award, which is the MVP award in the Iditarod. The Iditarod is the World Championships. Essentially, a Golden Harness lead dog in the Iditarod is the highest honor a sled dog can receive. That is the pinnacle. And what was really neat about that is here's a dog that for all intents and purposes was not supposed to be a racing dog. And in any other kennel in the world would have been immediately eliminated for being too small and in many of the kennels too female. That would have been a strike against her right there, that she was simply too small. Some genetics, the males are actually too big and the females are preferred because it's more of a size weight thing than it is what gender they are. But simply by asking the question, what can you do, instead of saying this is what you are or this is what you're going to do, we find out a lot more about the dogs that we work with. Not only did she win the Iditarod, she went on to be the mother of most of the dogs in my kennel, including little Mr. Hero here. Now, Hero has the opposite end of the spectrum. Instead of being the smallest dog in my team, he is the largest dog in my team. But her real trait, I guess, was that drive, that desire. She always wanted to go. And that's become the #1 thing that we have to have, is a team that always wants to go and is excited to go. And I have one of the hardest working teams on the trail, but that takes a lot of, or it comes with a lot of responsibility, because these guys are going to put it all on the line. And they are trusting that when you're standing on the back of the sled, you're never going to ask them to do something that they can't do. You're never going to have them go 10 steps too far. Because if you ever burn that trust, they're going to start self-preserving here. Instead of leaning in that harness and pulling as hard as they can, they're going to say, you know what, I remember getting tired last time. I'm going to back off 10%. You do it again, they're going to back off 20%. Pretty soon, you're at the whim of the dog team. They're going to do whatever they want. Some days they feel like pulling, some days they don't. And you no longer have the ability to manage or direct that team. Now, not every single day of mushing is winning the Iditarod. We have a few challenges or adversities out there. Can I get your booty off, bud? Here we go. And I guess this is really where that teamwork comes down to being critical, not just nice or an advantage in a competitive aspect, but whether or not you're simply going to make it. I could use this picture and talk about the musher, up front, leading their team across the river, great. But the question is why? Why is the musher having to do that? Why is the musher having to be up there when clearly the musher should be on the sled? And I like to go back about, let's say 10 seconds in this image, just to say what happened leading up to this point. This musher clearly does not handle adversity well. Or I should say this team doesn't handle adversity well. So as the musher's reaching the river, they say with some trepidation in their voice, we're going to go straight ahead. But they already know that this is probably not going to go very well. The lead dogs get to the edge of the water, and instead of going straight ahead, they stop. right? They look at the water and like, yeah, we know this team does not handle adversity very well. They're going to stop right on the edge. Then the musher's going to come stomping up there, and now they're bodily pulling the dogs across the river. I'm pretty sure those dogs are not saying anything nice right now. And this is not an uncommon situation. We're going to cross 1,000 rivers like this every single winter in training and racing. So now as we look at this image, what do we have? We have a musher that's frustrated right now, getting their feet soaking wet, trying to pull a dog team through the river. We have two lead dogs that are not very happy with the situation, literally getting drugged through the water. I'm not a body language expert, but what are these two dogs saying right there? I don't think that's the international sign for cooperation, is it? I mean, they're literally doing everything they can to prevent what their musher is trying to do. I like the next dog here who has got his ears up and his tail up, and he's looking down the trail saying, wouldn't it be better to cross down here? Now we have people throwing out other suggestions, other options. What the musher said is no longer the option. It's just one of a selection of choices, right? Then you have your next group of dogs, and this is very common. They're the ones sitting there, particularly that white one, kind of hunched up. Both lines are slack, both in front and behind, just saying, when you guys get this figured out, will somebody please tell me what we're doing, and then I'll go ahead and happily pull there, but this is ridiculous. And then my personal favorite, all the way in the back, 180 degrees, he's going home. I'm out. Thanks, guys. This has been fun, but we're out of here. Now, eventually, this musher will get this team across the river. It's going to not be a pleasant experience. They're going to be pulling dogs in there. These guys are eventually going to get pulled in, and the next dog's probably going to do the same thing. And they will get to the other side, and they'll be all tangled up, which they already are. They'll have to get untangled, and they'll be back on the trail, and thank goodness that obstacle is behind us. But the next river that they reach, are they going to handle it any better? No. This team knows now, as they've always known, I think, in this case, that we don't handle adversity well. It doesn't matter if it's wind, if it's deep snow, or if it's water. We don't do things well. If it's anything out of the norm, it's going to become a cluster. And that's going to get worse and worse. The next river, if it's half this size, it's going to be just as big of a problem, and then half that size. So now, in contrast, let's take a look at this one. Now, this is not just about the musher. It's not just about the person and the dogs trusting the person. It's about the whole team doing it as a whole. Because these dogs got to the river, the musher said with quite a lot of confidence, we're going straight ahead. And the dogs pile on in the river. They go right through the other side. But it takes not just two lead dogs that are willing to do it, because if those lead dogs do jump in the river and the next two dogs throw the brakes on, they can't pull the whole team through that thing. They're going to get bogged down, and it's not going to work out too well. It takes the entire team doing it as a team. That's the critical point there. So these guys, they pile on through the river. I hate using this picture because that is my dad, who, like I said, is one of my main competitors now. Unfortunately, unfortunately for me, he was having a very good race in this one, and I got there about 4 hours behind him, by which time all the camera guys were long gone because they were following the guy who was going to end up winning the race, which he did. This was 2013. Anyway, this is what you're going for, is that team that hits the river. They know they're going to do it. They know they're not going to be doing it alone. They know that the other dogs are going to be right behind them. They know that the musher's right behind them, and they also know that the musher's not going to ask them to do something they can't do. Something that they can't do as a team together. The dogs have no idea how deep this water is, right? All they knew is that the musher said we could do it, so we must be able to do it. They jump in, and they can do it because everybody does it together. They all have that same belief. And when this team comes out of this, they're going to be ready for something that's twice that hard. They're going to be ready for a storm that's way stronger, or a deeper water, or a wider river, because, again, each successful challenge leads to another successful challenge, right? It builds confidence. Confidence is something that you have to develop, build, and not just in themselves, but in the team as a whole. And in some races, this becomes what the entire race is about. In 2014, I did a run. The race was won and lost based on a team being able to work together and overcome adversity. It was no longer about really strategic racing. And it started with about 300 miles of this right here. There was no snow, like none. Went over the Alaska range, and it was brutal. We spent more time, not me, of course, but other mushers spent most of the time on the side because I never tip over. This is the thing with tipping over on your sled. Most people it happens to. If it does happen, you're going to tip over. You're going to hang on for dear life because those dogs are not going to stop. They're going to happily keep running down the trail. If you can keep up, great. If not, too bad. So you hang on for dear life. Generally, you get your parka filled up with snow, in this case, probably dirt. And then that friction of you sliding on your side will slow them down enough that you can flip the sled upright, Now, the next thing you do, this is a crucial point, is you look around and make sure nobody saw you tip over, because now you can maintain this idea that you never tip over, other people do. And then you're going to dump that snow out of your parka and continue down the trail. But this is what we spent the first couple 100 miles of the trail doing. Sleds were sent home in pieces, just absolutely destroyed. There was 1,000 opportunities for mushers to have excuses, why that they shouldn't keep going in this race. And many of them took those excuses. We had over 30% of the mushers dropped out of this race, many of them in the first couple 100 miles. 700 miles into the trail, we still had the same thing. Still no snow. It was creating a record-breaking pace because the trail was glazed ice, and it made no friction or resistance on the sled runners. The dogs had fairly good traction, and they were running all out, and we were just bouncing around behind them on a very slippery surface. My team is a fast team, but we're more a power team, and we don't have a great fifth gear. So in this race, I found myself with about a 10-hour deficit with 300 miles to go, and I figured that this wasn't our race to win, but we were going to make it, and we were going to beat my dad, which was pretty important. There's like 2 races within the race. We're racing for first, but then we're also racing each other. My dad's my best friend, so I can make fun of him. Believe me, he does way more of that than I do, that whole making fun of each other thing. So anyway, this is just a picture out there, absolutely no snow, continuing on. We were able to take that 10-hour deficit and get it down to about a 3-hour deficit with 70 miles to go, which I felt pretty happy with that. We still had good speed at the end, but because of the fast trails, those guys had gotten too far ahead of me. I wasn't going to be able to reel them in. Now, this picture I know is a terrible picture. I'm not a great photographer, and this was a GoPro, and it was blowing about 30 miles an hour up here. But what was interesting is this is now 45 miles from the finish. We're heading out up between White Mountain and Nome, and I stopped here because this is all the Bering Sea, and that should be white ice as far as you can see. Instead, it was black ocean, and there's these awesome ripples from the wind in the ocean out there, and it's really cool sunset. It looked cool. The picture's not great. But what we're going to do from here is pretty much drop down this mountain, follow this little edge of the beach all the way around, and Nome's over there in the sunset somewhere. And so I took this picture simply for that reason, and I wasn't in a big hurry. I had made up a lot of time on the front mushers. The leading musher was 3 hours ahead of me. Second place was 2 hours ahead of me. My dad was 2 hours behind me. So I was in a little buffer there, 2 hours in front, 2 hours behind. I felt fairly comfortable that it wasn't going to be too much of a challenge. Just to finish out the race, we weren't going to catch the folks in front of us, but whatever. And again, it was a little bit blustery here, but not so bad. You can see dog jackets kind of flapping in the wind. Took the picture, stuffed the GoPro back in my pocket, and took off down the hill. We made it about half a mile farther, and we kind of get around the base of the mountain there. And the first few dogs poked their nose around the corner, the next dogs, and then finally the sled. And as soon as the sled got out past the corner, we got hit with one of the most intense winds I have ever felt. It knocked me and the sled flat on our side. It knocked each dog over flat on their side. They're scrambling to try to get their feet underneath them. And the entire team, dog, sled, the whole works, is sliding sideways across this glare ice. After sliding for about the length of the stage, we were able to hit a patch of gravel that was exposed and didn't have ice underneath it. The dog's claws dug in. The fabric in my parka and the sled kind of scratched itself into the dirt. And there we sat for the next about minute while this gust of wind kind of blew itself out and then backed off to about a 45-mile-an-hour wind speed. I was able to get the sled upright. Bolt's a little shaken, but talked to my lead dog, Beetle, who's up in front there. Said, "Ready, boy?" He stands up, leans into the wind, and we go back and continue on. We make it about 100 yards, and the exact same thing happens. Now I'm starting to think that we've got 45 more miles of this to go through, and we do the same thing over and over and over. It was pretty intense, let's just put it that way, because every single dog in the team, now I only have 7 dogs in this team here, each time that they got blown over, and I don't know what the wind speed was. I heard 90 miles talked about a lot, 90-mile-an-hour winds. I do know that there are several 800-pound snow machines that the trail breakers were using because they went out to try to put out some more markers to mark the trail, which had all blown away. And even when those 800-pound machines were parked, when the wind would gust, it would blow them over. So whatever that wind speed is right there, I don't know. It's pretty intense. But every single instinct in these dogs is telling them when that wind hits them to curl up, cover their nose with their tail, and wait it out. You know, that's what genetics tells them to do. That's how they've been able to survive in this environment for a very long time. Then I'm asking them to stand up and go back in the storm and continue down the trail. Now, fortunately for me, these guys kept doing that one step after the next. And it started being a real surprise, I guess, or not I guess impressive, when you have a dog like Beetle that's willing to stand up again and again and again, walk into the storm again and again and again, and keep doing that day after day or hour after hour in this thing. It no longer became about making it 45 miles. It became trying to make it 100 more yards, make it to the next patch of ice where we're going to get tipped over. The dogs, they figured out how to hit the deck pretty easily and slide gracefully to a stop, wait till the wind blew out. I'd talk to them. They'd all stand up, be ready to go again. A couple hours later, we find ourselves cruising down Front Street in Nome, running into the finish line there. Quite a lot of hoopla. Here's Hero cruising along in swing. His buddy Beetle up in front of him. Yeah, that's you, bud. And we trot on underneath the finish line, and it had been probably the worst day of mushing ever. But it was very much like the first time that I won, and the amount of pride that I felt for these guys, and simply that what they were able to do. At any given point, had one of them decided that they were going to stay curled up and keep their nose covered up with their tail, none of us were going to be moving. All of us would have been stuck out there. So simply having made it through that was one of the bigger accomplishments in my mushing career. Now, as soon as I crossed the finish line, and I go up there, and this is actually Hero's sister, Glitter, and she's very much like her mother, Guinness. Very small, way too small actually to be a sled dog, except for she's now won the Iditarod, I think, 3 times, so so much for that myth. And what was neat about it is that trust was still intact, that this had been a tough day, sure, but we get up there, and she's licking me in the face thinking, what's next? Where do we go? Where's the food? You know, this is kind of the feeling that they have, because even though it was a very difficult situation, it was never overwhelming because none of them were on their own doing it. They were also working together to make it doable. Like I said, had any one of them ever curled up and covered their nose with their tail, none of us would have been moving. So this felt like it was one of the biggest accomplishments in the mushing career, just having simply made it through this storm. Well, as while Glitter was licking me on the face here, that one of the cameramen asked me this simple question, like, did you think you could do it? And I said, do what, make it? You know, it was tough, but he said, dude, you just won the 2014 Iditarod. And so now the whole story starts to unravel. The 2 teams that had been ahead of us, they had avoided much of the bad weather, but eventually had gotten shut down from it. One of the mushers, eventually one of their dogs listened to that instinct of curl up and cover your nose with your tail, and they sat there, and eventually a few snow machines were able to come out and get the dog team and get them to the next checkpoint. Another musher, the one that had been in second place, made it to the shelter cabin. It's actually technically a checkpoint of safety, and shut down there for a few hours, did not feel that her team was ready to get back out in the storm, which from a musher perspective is the right thing to do. If you don't feel that this is going to be a constructive situation for your dogs, if you're not going to be able to make it, then it's best not to ask them to do it, right? You have to set them up for success. And so apparently when I went through that spot, she was inside watching through the window and had seen me go through, and once I went by, I figured that it is doable, got the dogs hooked up, and then chased after us, and ended up crossing the finish line just 2 minutes and 22 seconds behind us. So that turned into something of a race there. But this whole one came down to the team that was able to make it, not who had the best strategy. It also keeps us a little bit humble, right? I didn't outrace the competition. We just simply made it. We got there with a team, and sometimes that's enough. But we also have to learn, because in that situation, the problem was it was too fast of a race. So how do I set up my team to be successful the next time? Next time we have too fast of a race. And we came up with a style which maximized the dog's power. Again, streamlining our team's strength. And I have the ability to carry 4 dogs between my trailer and my sled. I can have 12 dogs running. Pretty much extends our range. So now I can maximize that same fast trail. Rather than running in 5th gear or going too fast, we can go farther because I have a quarter of my dogs resting at any given time on a nice trail like that. We had to implement that style. 2015, we ended up winning that race by 4 hours. Even if you're still winning, you have to figure out what are we going to do next. That's the fun part. That's the part I enjoy. The target is going to be on first place. And you're the person that happens to be occupying that position at the time. It's your job to kind of keep that as a moving target. So after this one here, the next question is, what do we do next? What's the next biggest thing in this industry that we can improve or that we can change? And in the Iditarod, I felt like the next biggest thing was training these dogs year-round. I felt like our training was too compressed between September and March. How do we extend our practice year? Essentially, it's too hot. And if you're in Alaska right now, June, July, August, it's going to be 70, 80 degrees, way too hot for these fluffy dogs to be able to do their thing. So the question now is, how do we train these guys in the summer and not let them get too warm? Once you phrase the question correctly, it becomes pretty clear. you get a 55-foot reefer trailer and have a refrigerated treadmill so you can keep these guys exercising year-round. It's just one problem at a time, and that's where it becomes fun trying to solve these issues. And we're kind of a one-off kennel now. We're always doing something strange or something different. On this one, my brother was saying, why the heck would you do that? What you're doing is working. You've just won 3 Iditarods, right? Why would you change anything? Why would you change your training program? And my argument is things are going to change. And the reason that we've been successful is because we did change. We're adapting. We're always trying to figure out how to streamline something. You can't solve something once and then forever after, this is the way it's just going to be. That's how we had become successful in the race, was kind of independently verifying everything that mushing thought was true. We wanted to reassess everything and figure out if we could do it better, including how we train. So after using the treadmill, these guys broke the record here. 2016, they did it in 8 days, 11 hours. Took a few more hours off the record. 2014 was a record breaker. And each year, we try to improve something. Figure out an area that we spend a lot of time. What's something that we spend at least 5 hours doing on the race? How do I save 10% of that time? You do that in enough places, and it starts shaving hours. When I first started racing the Iditarod, the record was 8 days, 22 hours. This last year, the record was set again, or broken again. It's now down to 7 days, 3 hours. I mean, we've taken, 19 hours off the record time. I do have to point out that the person who broke the record this year was my dad. I finished in second place in 8 days, 6 hours. So we're bringing the time down and down and down. But what's happening is my dad and I have been racing each other, and now we're racing each other and we're racing for first. I think the last 6 Iditarods, either my dad or I have won. It's become a bit of a hostile rivalry, I suppose, but we're still very good friends, and I think the key now is I need to stop talking to him on the phone and telling him what we're doing differently, because he implements things in a much larger kennel than I have, and he has a kind of a greater impact when he does. But it's that healthy competition that keeps improving both of us. It keeps challenging both of us. And it is also rewarding because the success that he's having is using the same style. He's doing shorter runs. He's now carrying dogs the same way I am. He now trains his dogs all summer long the same way we do. But most importantly is the training. He does the same event-style training, and this is going industry-wide. How the races run. We're now putting a very high premium on finishing with fast running speeds. In 2016, for the first time, I ran a negative split Iditarod, where the last half of the race, our traveling speeds were faster than the first half of the race. They were finishing with stronger, healthier dog teams at the finish of the race. And what's great about it is if you want to be competitive in the Iditarod, you kind of have to get on board with it. So the entire sport is getting faster. Not just 1 or 2 teams, but everybody is improving. Third place this year was only about 3 minutes behind me in second place. So as there's more mushers joining the crowd, and we're seeing better and better dogmanship in this whole event. And that's been, I guess, the most rewarding part of it now, is seeing the styles that we developed that worked for the dogs, understanding how the dogs see the trail, understanding how they see the situation, and then the effects that it's actually working. And it all stems from just that, understanding the team, questioning how to do things better every single day, and I guess also being willing to then take the next step and implement something as long as it's been thoroughly tested, and creating an environment that testing is what we do, right? We have a training environment that enables us to try new things every single day. Well, I think Hero is expressing our sentiments quite well here. So I want to thank you all for taking the time to listen to our stories here, and Hero and I are going to hang out, and we'd be glad to answer any questions, but thank you all very much for listening to our stuff, and I hope there are some things that overlap with what you guys do on a daily basis. Hey, Hero, wake up, buddy. All right, thank you. He's like, what? I wasn't sleeping.
Dallas will take some questions, and Hero will be up there for a while. Between 11:30 and 1:30 today, and I'm in 456. We're going to have some light refreshment. Dallas will be there if anybody wants to come back a little bit later and have some interaction and conversation with them. He'll be available. But if anybody has questions right now.
You were pretty thorough, Hero.
Tell me a little bit about what you've learned in terms of performance in the face of sleep deprivation.
Whew, that's a heavy question there. 2 things, I guess, right off. One is mushers in general, I think people in general, become very pessimistic with sleep deprivation. And so knowing yourself and how you operate in that is huge. And so I've done enough studying of other mushers on the race, even before I was racing competitively, I took a snowmobile over the Iditarod so that I could actually see what the front mushers were functioning like. And that's where I became very adamant on streamlining the processes of taking care of the dogs in the checkpoint, because the sleep-deprived mushers were wasting so much time. And then in a leadership role, when you're sleep-deprived, understand that you are oftentimes pessimistic, if that's how you handle it personally, because I've seen so many mushers in the race that their job as a leader is to fixate on a problem, to see an issue. So you have 10 dogs on the team, and they will sit there and look at the 2 dogs that aren't 100%. And they will spend the last 7 hours mushing down the trail, going from one dog to the other dog. Oh, yeah, his gait's not right. Oh, that one's a little bit too thin. Gait's not right, too thin. They get to the checkpoint, and then they make a decision for the entire team based on those 2 individuals. And they end up holding the rest of them back. This is why I generally finish with the smallest teams in the race. It's not because we have worse dog care. It's because we have better dog care, quite frankly, and it's about having a higher standard of what gets to keep going down the trail. We're very selective about which dogs get to keep going down the trail, but when you finish up with 6 or 7 dogs and they are all perfectly healthy, that's why we're able to outrun the other teams by a minute a mile in the final miles of the trail. But it comes down, to answer your question, about knowing how you function in sleep deprivation and make sure that you don't end up in a fixating pattern where you're looking at the same thing over and over. Take it in context, zoom out, view what do I look like in this situation, what does my team actually look like in this situation, not just from your own perspective, because you have to take into account if, okay, I'm not feeling well because that could affect my decisions in what way. Is that right, buddy? All right, hero. Well, first of all, thanks for noticing. Honestly, if you train a dog team correctly, you're going to be in the right kind of shape. It's not high cardio. It's not like when you're wrestling, or when I was wrestling, it was really high intensity for 9 minutes. You had to have incredible cardio because you had to have the same explosive power in the final minutes as you did in the beginning. The Iditarod is more about prolonged agony and being able to just keep functioning for this amount of time. So if you train the team correctly in this event-style training, it does train you. In the beginning of the year, taking a 45-minute nap at 3 in the morning and then going in, the nap hurts you. It takes you longer to wake up. You might as well have just stayed up and had a cup of coffee. By the end of the year, doing that over and over, maybe not on the final days of the race, but certainly in the beginning, a 45-minute nap, I feel refreshed. I feel like I'm ready to go. I can function better. I can think more clearly. In fact, there is a time in the process of getting your dog's taken care of in the checkpoints. Once the critical stuff is done, if you're not functioning well, I just take a 45-minute nap, and I'll figure out whatever I still need to do because I know I'll be functioning better and more efficiently at that time. The second thing that happens, aside from you getting in shape, the second thing that happens if you train a dog team correctly is you're not going to have time to do anything else. That's what you spend your entire life doing. Me and 16 dogs spend a lot of time traveling down the trail, and you know every single dog by their tone of bark, by their silhouette, how they move, when they're scratching and you hear their little collar, the jingly stuff on their collar going, you almost always know which dog it is because you spent so much time with them. And almost subconsciously, your eye is then drawn to anything that's abnormal. Right? You know these guys so well that if someone's cruising down the trail, it stands out just as this glaring, obvious problem, something that nobody else would ever see because you have spent so much time with them, you know them so well. And that is crucial. You have to have that. Oh, hero. He's become quite the traveling companion. Fortunately, it wasn't a fight for the bed last night because he found the air conditioner. He curled up with that real quick. So, all right.
I want to thank you for
absolutely. Come here, hero. Come here, hero. Good boy.
And anybody wants to join us between 11:30 and 1:30,
can we go get a cup of coffee? If you guys want to say hi to Hero, you're more than welcome to as well. I will warn you that he's a dog and he is covered in hair. So you may have noticed some of those items. Oh, buddy. And this is his summer coat for sure. Hero boy.
All these strange people, Dad.
He's pretty comfortable with it in the long haul. There is.